Hello and welcome to this session on posters and presenting. This is a 301 workshop that's been adapted for a screencast, and I'm Ollie Johnson. I work at 301 as an academic skills developer on our academic skills program. So in this session we're going to cover various aspects of the poster presentation process. We'll start off by looking at the stages of planning for poster presentation. We'll move on to look at modes of communication and how that might impact on the design of your poster. We'll look at how to evaluate posters to see whether they're doing everything they're set out to do. We'll think about what makes an effective poster, and we'll finish off by looking at presenting your poster at a poster presentation conference. Okay, so first of all, planning for a poster presentation. The two stages that you need to take into account as part of the first steps of the planning process are to understand and know precisely who your audience is and to identify what the key message is that you want to get across to that audience. So audience, first of all, who are you going to be presenting your poster to? Is it going to be a tutor and your peers, or is this going to be part of a bigger poster presentation conference? Are they going to be disciplined specialists? Are they going to be members of the public? Are they going to have the specific background knowledge that they might need to understand some of the language that you might use? Or are you going to have to make sure that the poster is designed to be accessible to people without that background knowledge? So anticipating what the particular challenges of communicating your research are to that audience is vital as a first stage of identifying what you're going to put in your poster. Secondly, the message itself. So the principle here is that a important first stage of any research project is to write an abstract, a very short summary of the research project, setting out why the work's important, what the objectives of the work are, and the main findings, the kind of headline findings of the piece of work. And this would typically be a very short piece of writing, anything between 100 and 150 words. This is an important first stage of the poster presentation process too, but the abstract doesn't go in the poster as a section. Don't include the abstract in your poster. And the reason for this is that the poster itself is an abstract. The poster is a visual representation of the abstract. So once you've got the abstract, that's the perfect starting point for the poster itself. Okay, so they're the first steps. I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit about modes of communication and why a poster is an absolutely ideal way to present significant research findings. The principle here is that there are three main modes of communication. There's the verbal mode, the text, the verbal way of getting our information across, what we say. That's at the top of this pyramid, the information pyramid, because it's the most important. This is the thing, the message that you want to get across. Then there's the vocal, so how we say it, how we express ourselves, the type of language we use. This is in the middle because it's an important way to get that message across to the audience. But then there's another important field here to take into account. That's the visual mode, how we appear if we're presenting orally, what we show, what we demonstrate, but also how we use visual information within something like a research poster. The visual has the potential to be the most memorable, the most impactful part of the presentation process. But evidence suggests that representing information both verbally and visually at the same time can increase its impact, and that's exactly what a scientific research poster does. So this draws on a theory of psychology called dual coding theory that suggests our brains process verbal and visual imagery independently. By representing the information in both ways at the same time, we can increase its impact, and our understanding, our ability to recall information that we've been exposed to, draws on that interplay between verbal and non-verbal systems. Okay, so we're going to look at a few slides just to explore this a little bit further. And what I'm going to do is show a slide, and then if you can think about how successfully that slide gets its information across, and then we'll just talk about what the slide's doing well, what it's doing badly. Okay, so the first slide's coming up. Right, so on the face of it, this is quite a baffling slide. It's quite visually arresting, so we'll perhaps sit up and pay attention to it, but it's a little bit confusing. We're not quite sure what's going on here. This is an image taken out of context. It doesn't really give us anything to pin our understanding onto. Okay, the next slide is coming up. Okay, I deliberately haven't left very long for you to read this slide. And the reason for that is that I think this is the kind of slide that we see quite often in presentations. It's a very text-heavy slide. It's got a lot of bullet points. It's got a lot of information. And sure, the information's probably relatively clear here, but it's difficult to take in this amount of information in a slide through a purely textual way of imparting that information. Okay, the next slide's coming up. Okay, so this is getting a little better. The amount of text has been reduced. We've only got a couple of bullet points here. We've got sort of a subheading as well, and we've got an image that helps us to sort of pay attention to what's going on. It perhaps wakes us up again. It makes us think in two different ways about the information that's being put across. But here, the image we've got, it's not directly relevant to the text. It's a piece of clip art. It's just been pinched off Google. It's not going to significantly help us to increase our understanding of what's going on here. I would say this is the type of slide that we're perhaps exposed to most at university, and it looks familiar, and it's familiar in the way it gets the information across. But I would argue that we can do a lot better here. So the next slide's coming up. So here we've got hardly any text. We've just got two images and captions for those images. Now, I would argue that this slide has just as much information in it as the text-heavy slides we looked at previously. The information is there, but we have to construct it. We have to engage actively with the slide, with the two images, to create the connections between them in our heads, to understand the logic of the connection. And that active process of engagement makes the slide much more powerful in its ability to get a message, an argument across to us. So I would argue that using images carefully, using images to tell stories, can be a really powerful way to get your message, your argument across to your audience, your reader, the audience for your poster presentation. So moving on from this, similar principles are at play in the infographic, and this is infographics have really risen to prominence a great deal in the last few years, as they become more accessible through internet sources like Twitter. The reason infographics are well established as a way to get messages across is that they do just what we've been looking at. They present information in both a data heavy but a visual way at the same time. So they're getting data across to us using visual methods. So if we look at this quite simple infographic, the principle here is quite a similar one. We're seeing a graphical representation of some data. The numbers here are relatively small, but they're still perhaps not that easy to engage with as numbers on their own. So the infographic goes a step further. It adds the visual interpretation to help us understand what the numbers mean. So while the number 388 is perhaps it's a number, without any extra context. If we see a jumbo jet and we imagine that 388 is the capacity of that jumbo jet, suddenly we can easily visualize what 388 people look like. Similarly, at the other end of that spectrum, we can see a minibus that perhaps has 20 people on it, and we can easily visualize that change from a jumbo jet to a minibus. It helps to increase the impact of the data that's represented here, and this is done really commonly in lots of disciplines, lots of fields. When we sort of hear about data described, other examples that you might be familiar with would be, for example, the amount of rainforest that's getting chopped down annually, which might be referred to in the numbers of football pitches or the number of Waleses that are disappearing annually as the forests are chopped down. So fixing data to something accessible and visual is a really great way to increase the impact, increase our understanding of what that data actually means. So infographics are definitely something that you might want to consider as a way to maximize this use of the visual, the verbal and the vocal modes of communication in your research posters. Okay, we'll move on then to look a little bit more at the content and design of your posters. So what's going in it and what it's going to look like. So on content, first of all, what goes in an effective research poster? There are various sections that tend to be included in research posters. Yours may or may not have all of these sections, but they're certainly worth considering. Some background information, some context explaining the significance of your research, perhaps the aims, the basic aims of your study, the methodology that you've employed to conduct the research, any of the key results, the key findings, and you're not going to want to put all of the data and information in here, but just the sort of key highlights. What are the main headlines that can be taken from this research? Some element of discussion, some broader implications, recommendations for practice, basically some kind of opening up of what does this research mean. Absolutely important to include references in your research poster just as you would in any other academic piece of work. Don't go for sort of full reference list of everything you've used in the whole piece of research, but just stick to the key references that have informed what you've put in the poster and perhaps the key works that have informed the shaping of the project. And I think very importantly also your contact details. The whole principle of a scientific research poster is to disseminate your work within a field, to get your name out there, to make connections and develop your own networks. So having your contact details prominently displayed on your poster is absolutely important. And it's yours, you should be proud of it. Right, some notes then on putting together the poster. The sort of nuts and bolts of how you go about designing a research poster. First things first, check the requirements. This is vitally important. Don't be the person that turns up at the research poster conference to find they've produced a landscape poster when you were expected to produce portrait posters. Okay. Find out what size you're supposed to be using, what format you're supposed to save it in, whether you're supposed to print it off in a hard copy. So make sure you know as much as you can about the requirements before you get started. Once you know what you're actually expected to do, you need to think about how to organize the information that you've got in the form of a narrative within the poster. And here you'll want to think about the principle of reader gravity. This is the principle where we're accustomed to various standard methods of sort of following information through a page or a poster. So don't scatter your information randomly in the poster. It's an obvious point, but make sure it follows the standard conventions of how we tend to read information. So either go for this up and down zigzagging process, or you can go for a horizontal zigzag. Keep it concise. So we're trying to convey a message both textually and visually. don't overdo the text. So use as little text as possible to set out your narrative. So the recommendations would be between 300 and 800 words. That's obviously a huge range. The principle here is to use as little as possible. Be as sparing as you possibly can with the text. The less text you have in your poster, the more impactful it will be on the audience. It needs to be readable from a 2 to 3 meter distance. Organising your text in bullets is fine in a poster. Using numbering and headlines can help the reader to follow which section they're supposed to look at next. And one way to make sure that you're adhering to these rules, making your poster readable, is to use the A4 test. So the principle here would be if you're producing an A1 research poster, which is the sort of standard size, then print it out at A4 and see if you can read it. If there's anything that you can't read at all on an A4 page, then it probably needs to be enlarged for the A1 version so that it can be readable from a distance. And remember here, less is more in a research poster. Don't try and stick everything in just because it's there. So we've already talked about this a bit, but make it visual, use images to break up the text and draw the viewer in. Your images should, though, be relevant to the argument, so do not use clip art. A scientific research poster is not a place for using clip art. And remember that graphs or graphical representations of data are much easier to understand than tables of data. If you're tempted to put tables of data into the poster, think about whether it's absolutely necessary. Can you represent that table in a graphical form, or can you just explain what that table is trying to get across using words? So this is just a very quick example of a poster that's gone for a quite significantly text-heavy approach. Table-heavy approach. Quite hard for the reader to actually understand what this poster is trying to get across. Okay. So images that you do use need to be clearly labelled and related back to the relevant text. So make sure that, although I've talked a lot about how images are important to include, make sure they're there for a reason. Make sure they're illustrating something concrete that is actually referred to in the text, and don't overdo it. Lots of images, bright and colourful posters, but there's an awful lot of visual information here, and it makes it quite hard to follow the order that we're supposed to engage with it in, and it also makes it quite tricky to sort of understand exactly where the images are referred to in the text. So a great starting point is to use paper. It seems counterintuitive perhaps if you're going to be doing the whole thing on a computer, but it's a lot easier to play around with design principles on a page of A4 paper with a biro before you start committing it to the screen. Be careful with backgrounds. Solid colours are preferable. Pale with dark text tends to work best of all, but do avoid any gradations or big background images, as that can really get in the way of the information that you're getting across. So some examples here, we've got a big background image that I think makes it quite hard to read the text in certain areas of the poster. And we've got a gradation where the paler colours in the grey actually interfere with the white of the text. Okay, aim for balance and symmetry as well. So a poster that's balanced and symmetrical, it just feels easier to understand than a poster where the images and text are jumbled up on the screen. It makes for a more pleasant viewing experience. So here we have a poster where the symmetry is perhaps a little bit confused. Here we have one where the symmetry is nice, it's balanced. We've got a kind of diagonal running through the poster. Linked to that, again, thinking about your reader, making their life easier, align blocks of text where you possibly can. So here again, we've got a poster where the blocks of text aren't aligned, they're kind of jumbled up. Here we have a nicely organized, structured poster where the blocks of text are completely aligned. White space is your friend. Don't be afraid of it. Use it. You don't have to fill every single square centimetre of your poster. In fact, please don't fill every square centimetre of your poster. Use the space to, make sure the stuff that is there is bolder and stands out. And I think the final point, do be prepared to take a risk. There are lots of conventions of scientific research posters, but you can just take a punt and try something different, so long as the content isn't compromised. So to be prepared to take that risk. So a couple of examples of where I think a riskier structure, perhaps the use of big background images, is justified by the sort of the content of the poster and how it's organized. And I think just a nice idea of how as principle an idea can be used, something quite original that helps to organize the structure of the poster in a different way, a surprising way, and one that makes us, I think, sit up and pay attention when we see a poster like this. Okay, I don't want to sort of talk too much more about the formatting of your poster, other than to say the absolute best way to get a sense of what works and what doesn't is to have a look at example posters from previous years. There's a poster bingo handout available that you can download along with this screencast. So download that, have a look at some example posters from previous years if they're available on Mole perhaps. Get your poster bingo and see if you can spot any of these formatting, these less than perfect principles of formatting on the poster bingo. And watch out for them in your own work as well. Try to avoid them when you're putting your own research posters together. Okay, final section then on presenting your work. What actually happens when you go to the poster conference? So the principle here is that you've got your poster. The poster is the starting point. The poster is the abstract of your research project. But it's important to remember exactly that. The poster is the starting point. So give the audience at the conference time to come and read your poster, engage with it fully. Don't pester them while they're trying to read what's in it. But then if they want to have some further clarification from you, they can read what's in the poster themselves. You don't need to read it back to them. So try and add something extra. Anticipate what questions they might have. Be prepared to explain some of the more complex elements of their work, and perhaps try and make it real for them. So, what was it like doing the research on this poster? Were there any bits that you got stuck on? Were there any big challenges that you encountered along the way? Did it make you think of anything really significant that could be done next? Where does the research lead? So give the audience at the poster presentation something extra beyond what's included in the content of your poster, some way to make it really memorable for them. And anticipating questions is a really good one, but be prepared for the question that you haven't expected, and don't be afraid to just say, I don't know the answer to that. If you need to, that's absolutely fine too. Okay, that's it for the session. I think we've covered the things we set out to. So we've gone through planning for a poster presentation. We've looked at modes of communication. We've looked at evaluating posters and what makes poster effective. And we've talked quite briefly about presenting your poster. I hope it's been a useful session. I hope that you're successful in the development of your own scientific research posters, and I hope the presentation of your posters goes well. Thanks a lot for listening.